Well, welcome to you three and to all of you in the audience. It's quite an extraordinary bit of history we have on the stage tonight. Dan, you have covered 10, possibly 11 presidents. Helen, 10.
10. The 11th one I never covered. I was in Europe at the time, but starting with my reporting for duty for CBS in Washington in 1953, I've had, in one way or another, some assignment with all 10 presidents from Eisenhower to Bush, number 2.
And Helen, you were close behind with 9?
9.
And Scott, alas, only 1.
I'm the kid of this group.
But I must say, an important one. Since we do have, by my reckoning, almost 3 centuries of experience collectively here, I thought I'd begin by asking each of you, what got you into this craft? And how are you feeling about your decision, whenever it was, that you would become a journalist? Dan, let's start with you.
Well, there's a story that I tell in my book. At the age of 12, living in an apartment on a ground floor with my widowed mother and my brother, and one day, on a very hot day, I heard a big plop outside the window. And I looked, and it was somebody who had jumped or fallen from the roof, lying there dead. You might think I'd never seen anyone dead before. You might think that I'd be shocked, moved, emotionally charged by this whole thing. What I did was to go out there, wait till the police arrived, and take a lot of notes by asking the police what they knew about this apparent suicide. And I lived in the Bronx, and the local paper, the Bronx Home News, offered $5 for original news tips. So I called up the Bronx Home News, and I might have said, "Hello, sweetheart, get me a rewrite," but I didn't. But I decided if I could stand aside from the events, tragic, funny, and all the rest, and look to report them for somebody else, I guess I had to become a journalist.
Helen, what inspired you to take this road?
Nosiness. I saw my byline in the high school paper when I was a sophomore. My ego swelled. I figured I could cut classes, I could get into everybody's business, and this is it. And I had a one-track mind. I love journalism. I love the wonderful ambiance and the conviviality and camaraderie that you always feel working on a paper. I'll bet you there are so many people in this room who've worked on school papers, and it's a wonderful feeling.
Scott, what got you into this trade?
I was a miserable failure as a business major, and just about everything else I tried. I couldn't get through accounting, I couldn't get through calculus, but I knew I could read, I knew I could write. So finally I abandoned this business track and went into English and joined the school paper. From there I came here, joined the AP right after that. It's the best move I ever made. I have a front row seat on history every day, as they say.
Which of all the presidents, and you could be included here, Scott, even though you haven't covered them all, would you say really inspired you as a journalist?
Well, it depends what you mean by inspired. The journalist who really inspired me, if I can use the word my own way, was President Nixon. He inspired me to cover Watergate. He inspired me to try to find out what had gone on there. He inspired me by writing a list of his enemies, and which he listed me as number 17, right behind Paul Newman. And in that sense, he made me feel that the function of a journalist, along with a few FBI people, was to save the country and save the Constitution. So while it was not his intention, President Nixon really inspired me.
Ellen, I think you actually said at one point that whenever confronted with two alternatives and the necessity to make a decision, Nixon invariably chose the wrong one.
That what?
That Nixon invariably made the wrong decision when confronted
Always.
with a...
But I'm really inspired. I think I've covered only one president who had his eyes on the stars, who was truly inspired. He told young people to go into public service, went for the first nuclear test ban treaty, created the Peace Corps, of course, Kennedy, and said, of all things, we're going to land men on the moon. Imagine. And he knew there was a world out there, a universe, knowledge that we had to explore, and you have never covered a president who had that much drive and enthusiasm and caring about humanity. No, no, LBJ too, for humanity.
Scott?
Well, my political consciousness began with the end of Nixon's presidency, and I was one of those kids considered sort of freakish with his nose in the newspaper at age 5 or whatever it was, watching with great interest as this presidency fell apart. I remember reading about Carter's cabinet disintegrating. So I had an interest in this going way back to childhood.
Is there something about the process of things falling apart rather than cohering, which is particularly alluring to you three?
Makes much better news, that's for sure.
And yet, Helen, you were enamored of Kennedy. You were quite taken with his idealism and his...
All presidents hate us. I mean, that doesn't, I mean, it goes with the turf. You expect that. So I think that we see their flaws as much as we admire, but you also know the direction. I think when you get to be president, you've reached the top of the mark. Ain't no other place to go, and you should always want to do the right thing.
You know, in talking to you all today, I mean, I have a feeling, not only from our conversations, but from what is going on in the world, that there is a sense that the nation is now at some very critical sort of tipping point moment. Do you all share that sentiment?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, speak.
In the first place, if the world is not at a tipping moment, we like to see it that way because that makes our jobs more interesting, so that we occasionally help the tip wherever we can. But it is true, something else has happened. There's been a relationship between the press and the presidency which has evolved over the years. I mean, I didn't cover President Franklin Roosevelt, but I was alive and knew the fact from history that a press conference with President Roosevelt with a dozen people standing at his desk at the Oval Office taking notes and never quoting what he had to say, and certainly no pictures of him in a wheelchair. There was a time in which the president and the press had civility between them, and somehow that began to go downhill somewhere around the time of Nixon, and it began to become increasingly an adversary procedure. I've seen tapes. I've seen tapes of Nixon in which he said, "Those press, they are sons of bitches," and all the rest. They start with the fact that the press is the enemy. But Bill Safire, in a book about Nixon, has a chapter, quote, "The press is the enemy," unquote. And those words came from Nixon. And since that time, it's been more and more that way. The president has hired people who are extremely skillful in manipulating the press, getting pictures of him in front of a lot of flags, getting pictures of him landing on the deck of an aircraft carrier, making sure the aircraft carrier is positioned exactly right to catch the last rays of the setting sun and all of that. And they think they have a right to present their images as they want their images to be seen by the American people, and deeply resent the idea that the press won't always let them do it. They succeed more often than they don't, I must say. But every now and then, we manage to open up one little corner and let a little light in, and they don't like it.
But Dan,
We've always had managed news. I mean, the word was coined in the Kennedy era. We've been manipulated, we've been controlled, and so forth. But I have never seen anything that got to the state of the art in this administration. It's the most secretive I have ever covered.
how do you experience this, Scott? I mean, you're there every day in the White House. You fly around with the president. Do you feel that you're sort of trapped inside a glass bottle trying to get out?
It's brutal. Getting information out of these people is like banging your head against the wall every day. The information we get only rarely comes from the spokesman at the podium or the president at the podium. It's all about developing sources, people who are not in that podium, and hammering them day after day, building, relationships the best you can to smoke information out of them that they won't give you from the podium.
Helen, you said, I just will paraphrase, that you had spent the first 50 years of your life being intimidated, and you didn't want to do that anymore. What's the state of intimidation sort of on a historical...
I wasn't intimidated. I meant that I really had to walk the line of just the facts now. Now I can wake up every morning and say, who do I hate today? I'm writing columns. No, I'm allowed to express my opinion. I've had an opinion on everything since the day I was born, I think, but I really tried to curb it and always walk the line for just the facts, ma'am, for a wire service, as Scott has to too. But now I can go for broke.
But of course, most of the press is not a columnist.
That's true.
And they have to try to make...
Well, they do a much better job because the people should just have the facts. My opinion doesn't matter. What is really great is our front pages still have the news, and that's the most important thing.
So how does one really report an administration that, in effect, is dedicated to giving relatively little out and to spinning what it does give out?
Well, I think it's very difficult, especially when everything they've said practically now in terms of a preemptive war, invading Iraq without provocation, everything's come home to roost so quickly. Because of this is a new world of communications. Everyone's wired, everyone's on camera, and it's very little running room for really being that deceptive.
Luckily, there are 535 members of Congress with their own agendas and their thousands of aides, and they leak like mad because they have to get reelected every 2 years or 6 years. So a lot of our information at the White House comes from the Hill or from agencies with their own axe to grind.
Describe for us what it's like to be in Washington amongst the press corps now. What's their state of mind?
The press corps? They don't have one state of mind. But I think that 9/11, really we all rolled over and played dead because everyone was afraid to be called un-American, unpatriotic. It segued into the war, and once again, you are on your mettle. You think the American people are watching these televised briefings, that they may think you're jeopardizing the troops if you ask a question. So I think all of us were hemmed in, but they're breaking loose. We're coming out of our coma, finally.
I think that Helen is right. This administration, perhaps more than any that I've experienced, believes that they're control freaks. They want to have control of information, want to have control of what people think, what people see, and what people know about them. And they try very hard to do that, and on a whole they succeed. There was a sea change that came with 9/11. Up until then, it was a fairly squaring off against each other. But after that, there was this immense advantage of being president at a time when the United States was in a state of shock and looking for nothing more than a father figure. And he went and filled that bill very well with some skillfully well-written and even eloquent speeches. And from then on until now, it has been very, very difficult to do anything without the fear of being accused of being not quite patriotic. I think that's been true since 9/11. I think, however, it's beginning to change again. Nothing lasts forever in this country. And interestingly, the polls are beginning to show that the president's popularity and job performance ratings are now about where they were before 9/11. So he's had a very good time, been able to say what he wants, do what he wants, and criticism has been muted because Americans don't like to be, even press don't like to be called unpatriotic. I think we're going back to normal.
And what would happen if there was another terrorist event?
The landscape would change all over again.
I think we'd still be more, we'd still start asking questions, because it's very clear this administration did not want to get to the root causes of terrorism. What is terrorism? Why? We were the most beloved. We had a halo. We were on a pedestal. And then all of a sudden we're hated, and no one wants to find out why. The president has tried to kill. Major investigations of getting to the root causes of this, of bin Laden, the whole phenomena. And there is something ongoing now, but it's very slow mail. To get to the truth, I mean, how can you solve a problem unless you know the cause?
What do you all make of this seemingly endless debate that the media is either cravenly liberal or cravenly conservative?
Baloney. On the liberal, I'm looking for a liberal.
Well, we know that, Helen. But, I mean, there is a very strong
It's
field.
a fallacy. It's a fallacy. It's a myth. There is no such thing. I think that the press, the columnists certainly have swung far to the right. Look at the Washington Post. I would say that most of them were conservative, the columnists. And the New York Times has hired now another conservative to offset Krugman, I guess.
I mean, do you three feel that sometimes you're playing on a field with goalposts that shift back and forth, and there's a huge sort of percentage and a lot of pressure just to always stay in the middle, wherever the goalposts move?
No, I think that after Watergate, the newspapers suddenly got afraid that they had deposed the president. And they all started hiring conservative columnists to say, see, we're very fair. But it's swung totally to the right now since Reagan. There was a Reagan revolution that turned the country to the right, where it remains today.
Talk about broadcast. I mean, none of you really, you were in broadcast for many years at CBS, Dan, but that really is the way most people get their acquaintance with the world. How do you think we're doing in the world of broadcast as a vector of?
Well, people talk about the news media, and there's a distinction has to be made. Journalism is only a very small part of what happens on the news media. Most of what happens is, for example, the president makes a speech. Well, it's not journalism. He talks directly to the people on television. And the ability to control what goes out on television is what gives you the final impression of what the president is like. All of the press, be it liberal, conservative, or whatever, the things that we call the press, journalists, have very little effect in comparison with what the president can do himself by his control of getting on the airwaves.
And yet, it is common wisdom that we live in a rather sound-bitten world. When you consider the potential of broadcast, I wonder if you all feel that broadcast is performing the function that it could perform, perhaps should perform.
No.
No.
I think that reducing everything to a sound bite, and the whole corporate control now of television. Think of GE. I mean, there used to be a day of Bill Paley and Sarnoff. Sure, they wanted to make money, and they did make money, but they understood great news divisions, and they left them alone and let them perform. I don't think you have that now in television, sad to say.
So how do you, particularly Helen and Dan, feel things have changed during your lifetime? As you look back when you began up until now, what have been the major shifts, positive or negative?
Well, Shall I tell you something? Would you believe it if I told you that when I was a journalist before television was invented? Would you believe that? That I saw the first demonstration of experimental television at the New York World's Fair in 1939. At the time, I went and looked at a picture being a grainy black and white picture being transmitted 100 feet from here to there, and decided it was a nice toy, but it probably wasn't going to amount to anything very much. And I was wrong. What television has done, television is basically not a medium of information. It is basically a medium of, a medium of emotion. It's a medium of entertainment. And all of what we call the press in the old days today occupies a small corner of a vast entertainment stage. And it is true that all the networks at one time had leaders who, in part because they wanted to make sure they didn't lose their television licenses, performed a great deal of public service. And you had Paley, you had Sarnoff,
They had
and
to
you
in
had,
the law.
and they had to, especially, there was a period when there was great scandal involving quiz shows, and in order to get their reputation back, they began doing more and more interpretive documentaries of a kind that you hardly see anymore today, 60 Minutes perhaps, and all the rest of it. What has also happened is that the founders, the original founders of this broadcast empire are gone, and every one of these networks has been swallowed up by a larger conglomerate. And the more this happens, the more these mergers take place, the further away the top boss is from where news is being made. And all he wants to know is the bottom line. And so desperately today, news departments and television desperately try to cling to their audiences by making things as entertaining as possible. The result of that is you're lucky if you get very much news at all on news programs after the first 8 or 10 minutes of commercials. Television today performs its own destiny. Its destiny is to tickle you, make you cry, make you laugh, arouse sexual desires, God knows all of that, because that's where the ratings lie.
I think that the tragedy is one newspaper towns. That's what's... Competition used to be our real lifeblood. And I think the fact that we don't have as many newspapers, they aren't as competitive, the advertising obviously has flowed to TV and so forth. So you don't have the kind of newspapering that we used to have. You still have some great newspapers, but not in the same way. I think New York had dozen papers, didn't it?
Yeah, yep.
At one point. Most major cities had 2 to 3 newspapers, and they've faded.
You know, I wonder if, in your experiences, journalists today feel as content with their lot, and particularly maybe your generation, Scott, as people did before, which might imply there was some halcyon period. But I mean, do you feel that people are happy, proud, and dignified by what they do? Pardon?
The salaries are better.
Well, in broadcast, they're better. In print, they're not always so good.
Astronomical in some broadcasts.
I would be atypical because after having fought my way with 25 years with CBS and 5 years of Ted Turner, which is another interesting experience, I am today no longer a reporter. I now am called a news analyst, which means I get to say what I think things are. And it really is a glorious life in which I don't have to go chasing around or put makeup on the Max Factor or worry about the camera angles and all the rest of it. So that I am, after many, many years, reasonably content with my professional lot. But I don't think I'm typical.
Scott, how would you describe the people you work with?
Well, I work in a very narrow sphere at the White House, and you asked earlier about the morale. There's a lot of resentment and I think low morale at the White House right now. It's a very difficult, unpleasant institution to cover sometimes. The other point I would make is that sometimes journalists, I think, right now are getting too comfortable. It used to be a blue-collar, roll-up-your-sleeve, ink-stained wretch bunch, and now we have network people in particular being paid a lot of money. Journalists are now generally of the middle class, and as a result, I think sometimes they don't key into what's happening outside the middle class.
Do you think when they sit in a press conference with the president or Ari Fleischer or whoever, there are many questions that they know they should ask, would like to ask, but don't ask?
I do, for a variety of reasons. Part of it's beltway mentality. Part of it is that journalists are of the middle class and the middle to upper middle class now. So sometimes questions that should be asked don't get asked. There's a new poverty report that came out the other day that showed millions of people have fallen into poverty in the last couple of years. And I think reporters did ask about that. Could they have asked more questions? Probably.
Helen, I know you were at this press conference yesterday, and I was looking at the transcript earlier when the question of Ambassador Wilson and his wife came up and the leak allegedly from Mr. Rove. It was about 15 pages of just dental drill on the press
I
secretary.
told you we were coming alive. Finally.
What had happened previously to...
I think there's been a buildup of realizing. I get read my mail. I found the delete button, but anyway, really lambasting reporters because you're out there watching this press conference or briefing, and you say, "Why didn't he ask that? Why didn't you follow up? Why did you let them get away with that? You're all a bunch of, you know." So I think that it's finally getting, the reporters are finally getting the message that they are the only conduit to the American people. Most American people don't understand that the presidential news conference is the only forum in our society where a president can be questioned. If a president isn't questioned, he could be a dictator, a ruler. I mean, you have to question them. They have to be accountable. So I think that we have defaulted because we rolled over so much during these critical periods.
Now, for those,
Afraid of our bosses maybe thinking, you know, don't rock the boat.
well, for those of you who don't know, Helen does have a penchant for jumping up in press conferences with very insistent and persistent follow-up questions.
I'm in the back row now.
Well, tell us about that. Tell us how this came to pass and what kind of ostracism is reserved for people who do tend to be insubordinate.
Well, in the old days, during the FDR days, FDR, you can't believe it, during World War II, had 2 news conferences a week in his office. He could not be quoted directly, but he handled the press, believe me. If a reporter asked a question they didn't like, he'd say, "Go stand in the corner and put a dunce cap on." He handed the Iron Cross, the Nazi cross, to John O'Donnell,
The Chicago Tribune.
New York Daily News, right? Chicago Trib. So, I mean, it was tough out there. You definitely, presidents can
Oh, wait a minute, but
describe your.
you left that little story hanging. Why did he give him the Iron Cross?
Why did he?
Why did he hand the Iron Cross?
Oh, he had. They broke the Chicago Trib broke the story during World War II that we had broken the Japanese code. That's right. So he felt that that was treasonous. And so reporters have been manhandled and they've been declared persona non grata. A phone call from the press secretary or even the president himself to the head of a newspaper or publisher and say, you know, get this man out of here, get this woman out of here. So it can be subtle or it can be a Mack truck, but it works. And in case of Dan Rather, he was kicked upstairs when he had a colloquy with Nixon. So
What happened to you?
what happened? Oh, I just asked mean questions.
And what was their... Tell us a little about their response and
Well, I think that the president has the right to call on whoever he wants to call. That's his privilege. But I think that when you get to be president, you ought to be able to handle anybody. You ought to be able to handle any question. There's always saying no comment, I can't deal with, I can't discuss that now. You can always do it. But I don't mind my exile. I just hope the questions will be asked by someone.
Helen is a very independent lady. Not all reporters covering the White House feel tough and strong enough to be that independent. For one reason, because they know that their bosses are watching on C-SPAN, and they want to get their faces on camera so the boss will know that they're working. If you want to get your face on camera, you better acquire a reputation for asking softball questions, and you'll get called on more often. So these reporters sitting there know they are under pressure to play this game the White House's way, if only to get on television themselves.
Do you collectively think that the press has gotten softer in the last 5-10 years? Or
Yes. And how?
Scott, you're right in the belly of the beast.
I'm gonna invoke my short career here and decline to judge what's happened over the last 10 years. I do think the press has something of a bad rap. After the news conference that Bush gave right before the war, there was a torrent of criticism. Some of it was well placed, that we hadn't asked hard enough questions heading into a war. I know reporters felt stung. Some reporters felt stung by that criticism and resolved to ask tougher questions. I do think reporters often ask the right questions and don't always get credit for it because it's not always on TV. Bush rolled out a 100-day report, 100 days after he landed on the aircraft carrier. He summoned his war counsel to Texas and handed us reporters a 100-day progress report. And of course, it was a glowing report on how great things were going. This was just last month. And I asked the president, can you tell us how many more Americans are going to die? And, you know, is that tough enough? I mean, I think we're asking the right question.
What was his answer?
He sidestepped my question, and then I asked him again. And at that point, I feel like I've done my job. I'm not going to shout at him a third time. I write in my story, Bush sidestepped the question. So did his aides. We do what we can with a president who's not always interested in directly answering the question or engaging us.
Do you think the crop of White House correspondents, the people covering Washington now, are much different than at any time in the past few decades?
Well, but simply by the fact that television has come to dominate the field of journalism. I mean, Helen told you about how it was a small group of highly educated reporters would deal with President Roosevelt in a very informal way. They would never quote him directly. Everything was on background, and they would make jokes with them. Since that time, television has changed everything about the press. Today, since television now dominates it, to be a White House reporter and cover the White House, you have to be able to play that game. The president plays the game himself. The president himself is coached exactly on how to look, how to act, and the whole thing has become image making. And in the world of image making, what's an old-time reporter supposed to do?
Good question. What should a reporter do?
Well, if you're really very lucky, you get old enough to get some kind of job where that doesn't matter.
Well, if I may say so, Mr. Shore, I think you have a rather privileged position. You have a little island where you can actually do what you like to do, and you do very well.
Thank you.
I think it would be only fair to say that most journalists live in a much more circumscribed world, circumscribed not only by pressures, but by what their media outlets would like to have them do and how much space they'll give them.
That's true.
So what is one to do given that circumstance?
What is one to do?
Well, given the verities of the media today.
Walk in where angels fear to tread. Public servants have to be accountable, and it's our job to make them accountable. You can always be polite and so forth, but you should ask the questions that are out there. If we don't ask them, I mean, we have been emulated all over the world by reporters in countries that finally became free. The Soviet republics and so forth. I mean, you have reporters now following our format, which is just walk in and ask the question. They are accountable and should be.
Let's try some questions from the audience. For Helen Thomas, do you feel that journalism suffered because of the loss of UPI?
Of course. I believe in strong competition. I believe that it helps all journalism, and I think people are being deprived, and you hate to see anything go down. That's that Evening Sun. It's just been UPI had a tremendous reputation. Great reporters. I've known some of the greatest reporters who ever. Merriman Smith, who won the Pulitzer in Dallas. Just incredible. I think that's so sad, but I guess time marches on. It's very sad, though.
Are there any new bright lights of political journalism, or are we resigned to a future of Al Franken duking it out with Bill Riley?
It's hard to say. I mean, Americans are showing an increasing appetite for that sort of partisan news. I hope that objective, neutral news remains the staple of Americans' diet. I think that's a healthy thing.
Dan?
I support that. I mean, if you're a reporter, you can only report in a way that your boss wants you to. You've got to meet the requirements of your medium. I will also say, by the way, that it was a great shame that the UPI, formerly United Press, went downhill. I say this as one who at CBS saw Ed Murrow when he first started assembling his news team, hired people generally from United Press because they knew their way around, they knew news and all the rest of it. There was also another service called the International News Service, INS, and it was really wonderful to have 3 wire services. The AP is pretty good, but it'd be nice to have at least one other competitive news service, so we don't have it anymore.
I agree, but we do have Reuters, and there's also a proliferation of voices on the internet. There's more cable networks than ever. Hey, I'm all for more wire services, but I do think that the news media is fragmenting and proliferating in a way that none of us have seen before that could ultimately be healthy.
What would have happened if Edward R. Murrow was alive today? Would he have any place in this firmament?
Well, I always like to say if he
I
were
don't think
alive-
he'd have a job.
Well,
Not to put too fine a point
What
on it.
happened to Donahue?
I have said, and it would be impossible to be contradicted, that I feel that if Murrow were alive today, he would be working for National Public Radio.
Well, that's a kind of an interesting comment, because in effect what you're suggesting is that we sort of, at least in broadcast, that we let the rest go and we try to concentrate on some small archipelago of good, credible journalism that doesn't have to answer to the pressures of the marketplace.
I think that's exactly right. At NPR, it has, compared with television networks, on a relatively small audience, although the audience keeps growing by 5 or 6 or 7% every year. Some people think it's because there's a wonderful covering the news. I think it's because traffic jams are getting larger. But it fills our place in what is called niche journalism. It may not get millions and millions of people, but it performs a valuable service for those who are interested in getting straight information. And I think C-SPAN as well. You don't have to wait to have it interpreted. You can watch the thing in the press conference, the speeches, whatever. You can see them or hear them on C-SPAN and make up your own mind, which is also a good idea.
Who do you believe leaked Mr. Wilson's occupation, and will any heads fall of importance?
Oh, don't look at me and ask me to guess on that one. I don't know.
But is this a moment of some consequence for the nation and for the media?
No doubt about that. It also comes at a horrible moment for Bush. His approval ratings at the lowest of his presidency. Many or most Americans... Many or most Americans think that post-war Iraq is a mess or a disaster. He's got an economy that's not producing jobs. He's got Democrats knifing him in the back every day. And now a political scandal. I don't know who was responsible for this leak, if anyone in the administration, but I can tell you it comes at an awful political time for Bush, 13 months or so out from an election.
Helen, do you think the chemistry is changing in some significant way between the populace and this administration?
I think that the country is beginning to realize that they've been had. Every rationale for going into Iraq has been knocked down. I mean, at some point, the president has to be asked, why did you go into Iraq? No weapons of mass destruction, he said. No link between bin Laden and Saddam. Everything they set up has been knocked over, and it may land on page 22 in the New York Times, but it's still there and people will find it. The American people are really, I think, alert now to something is wrong. I mean, you always want to believe your leaders. You have to. No other place to go. My country, right or wrong. But at some point, you have to ask, how did this happen? How do we handle it now?
Dan, do you think this country has the same capacity as ever to ask the kind of questions Helen is suggesting, or do you think we have in some other way become less sharp-edged about this, more numb?
I think that ultimately the American public begins to show that it is possible to make some sober judgments. The art of pulling the wool over your eyes has become so fantastically successful that it may take some time. It takes longer, but in the end, if like little drops of water, one little thing after the other, so what's that about the uranium? What's that about this? Are they really telling us the truth? Why did they have to pick on this guy? Was it because he brought back the report that they didn't want brought back, that there wasn't any uranium going from Nigeria to so on, and one little thing after another, and it adds up, and after a while, I think Americans wake up as though from a dream and say, this is all a fraud. And then they react.
I saw two presidents go down the drain. Johnson and Nixon, because they lost their credibility in Vietnam and Watergate. You cannot be a president and keep deceiving. I mean, you can fool some of the people some of the time, but I think that at some point, no, you can't.
And Helen, do you think in this case, it's taken more or about the same amount of deception before people come to their senses?
Much shorter now. What, 4 months, 5 months? And the chickens are coming home to roost.
Well, you all sound like you're suggesting regime change is right around the corner.
I'm just suggesting that the ground is getting a little shaky.
However, don't ever underestimate the power of $80 million here and there, and what the money that they're raising can buy, and how much wool you can buy to pull over Americans' eyes.
You're right.
What is your impression of the new press secretary? And we might add Ari Fleischer into this mix. He doesn't appear to be as smooth and articulate as Ari Fleischer. What is our collective assessment?
He's not as slick, and that's a plus.
Give us a few thoughts on Brother Ari Fleischer, and then let's move to his replacement. Scott?
Fleischer was beloved by PR professionals. I was stunned to discover that one time at a dinner in D.C. with a bunch of PR people from New York. They worshipped him. He was extremely difficult to pry information out of. The joke about Ari was that you could leave a press briefing stupider than when you walked in. He would suck information out of your head. The jousts we had with him, the jousts that Helen Thomas and he had were legendary. McClellan is an affable guy. He's a likable guy. I've often found myself, especially early in his reign a couple months ago, when he was searching for the right word. Sometimes I'm on the other side of a wall when he's giving his briefing. I often found myself rooting for him. Scott, you want the word weapons? Early on, you'd see him sort of searching his hard drive for the right word and not quite. I think he's a pretty decent guy. He doesn't have that innate hostility and suspicion toward the press that a lot of people in this White House do. He's doing a job. He doesn't deliver the wink and the nod that McCurry used to do when we all knew he was just doing his job. McClellan's straighter than that. But he's certainly, there's a reservoir of goodwill for him, and he walks a very difficult tightrope between maintaining the respect and affection of the press corps and his boss. That's tough.
Who in the President administration have you found particularly receptive or interesting to inquiries from the press, discussion, who's been able to really kind of not defend themselves, but to participate in your inquiries?
No one leaps to mind. They're not all hostile to the press. In fact, some of them understand our role. They really do. But most of them are also under exceptionally tight constraints with what they are permitted to say to us.
They're like ambassadors. They don't make policy, they articulate.
Exactly.
Yes. Helen, you've been through a lot of press secretaries.
Through them.
Yeah. And what's your general impression of the state of progress of this avocation?
They're robotic now, they're all on the same page. They have good peripheral vision of everything they've written down, and they stay with the written word. It's amazing. The ideal press secretary has to be skits. They really have to wear two hats. First, you serve your first master, I suppose. You speak for the President of the United States. You speak for the United States. You speak for the whole federal government. You speak for the American people. The other hat is you speak to the press, which is the one conduit to the American people. And it's almost I think it's the second toughest job in the White House, and it certainly isn't impossible. You're in the bullseye every day, so I don't mitigate, the burden of that job, but it can be done well, and it has been done well. First, you have to have the sine qua non, which is direct entree to the President's office. You can't let the palace guards stop you. You have to be able to walk right in and say, Mr. President, this is what's happening. What are we going to say about it? What are we going to do about it? When we know they got it from the horse's mouth, it's much better. Some press secretaries had that kind of entree. Marlin Fitzwater, for one. Jody Powell.
Pierre Salinger.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Dan, what's your sense of how the role of press secretary has evolved?
Well, I think the role has changed some. I mean, it used to be that you sit through a briefing and then there's something you wanted to know which you were sure could not be said openly. You go back to the press secretary's office and ask, now, can you explain to me for background? And you would get some information other than the rather canned kind of information that comes out at briefings. That is, my impression is that's generally gone now. The press secretary is a real personality in his or her own right. I say her because of West Wing, but as I watch, you see it's a game that is played. This is what they want me to tell you, and this is what I'm going to tell you. And don't ask me for anything else, because my job here is to present what the White House wants me to say, and that's all you get. If it's not satisfactory, Tom Pease, too bad. I used to find it amusing to go and talk to a press secretary. I wouldn't today.
They war game everything. Every day you go to the senior staff meeting, the press secretary, and they lay down the line, and that's it.
From what you all are describing, it actually sounds not too dissimilar from what one confronts in a country like China, where the job of the press secretary is to simply articulate the party's positions, and you hardly know the person's name.
I think it's much more than that. We pay them. I mean, if the president wants a plaque, let him pay him. That's my feeling.
This questioner asks, if you have to be compliant in order to have access, how can you possibly be a source of reliable information? Let's start with you, Mr. Lindlaw.
That's a line I have to walk every day, and I hope I haven't pulled any punches. I mean, I ask the questions I want to ask. I write the stories I want to write, generally, with editing. Some days I file a story, and seconds later it's in the press secretary's computer, and I stare at the phone, and it rings immediately. And some days he has a point, and I'll change a paragraph, and some days I'll tell him I'm not the president's stenographer. We make the choices of what we write.
And yet Ari Fleischer was known to let it be known that certain reporters' stories had been taken note of in the White House.
One infamous story was that Ben Roth of the Houston Chronicle wrote a story about the twins, the president's twins, and the first family doesn't like their daughters written about. And the next day, Ari Fleischer told that reporter and told all of us that that story had been noted in the building. And that was their little pushback.
This is for you, Helen. I heard your challenge to Ari Fleischer about bombing Iraq into democracy. Since that policy has failed, what would you advise the White House to do now?
Go to the UN, share power, share the control, gradually turn it over to the United Nations and back to the Iraqis, I suppose. But I do think that we definitely, if we want troops and money from these other nations, we ought to give some facade, some semblance that we're willing to give up some power.
Do you think that will be the ultimate eventuality?
I think
Dan?
that's the only way to get out.
But how can you give up power and still make sure that all your friends get the contracts?
That's why we're not giving up power.
Well, here's a question that at least you analysts and columnists might grapple with. I don't know about you, Scott. Do you consider George W. to be an honest person?
Oh, that's kind of a tough question, because I'm sure that in his mind he is an honest person. I'm sure that when he says something different today than he said yesterday and so on, that as far as he's concerned, life has changed, things have changed. I would hesitate to call anybody dishonest simply because what he says today seems so different from what he said yesterday.
Well, that's charitable of you.
He handled that very well.
And how about you, Helen?
I do think that he believes he's honest. And I think that the limitations of his information and knowledge, he has really handled. If he doesn't read newspapers, and he said he doesn't, and he's relying on all his aides to tell him what's going on and so forth, he's very reliant. And I think that he does think he does the right thing. I'm sure every president has. So you can't make a judgment. You can have an opinion, but I think in terms of the president, I think he certainly believes in what he's doing.
There are things he says that we regularly raise questions about. One of my favorites is his opening line in his fundraising speech. And he's now raised $80 million for his re-election. That's just for the primary, in which he faces no opponent. He loves to open those speeches by saying that the political season will come in its own time. As if he hasn't ushered it in already.
Meanwhile, give me the money.
Right. Pass the hat.
Do you think broadcasting the 10 Democratic presidential candidates at 4 p.m. before most people are home from work was a fair decision? Or was the choice of that time slot a deliberate way to limit their exposure to voters?
That's for you.
Oh, well, they take the time that they get. I mean, we had Fox provided time for a debate, so they did a debate. For these people, Democrats who have so much less money than Republicans, anything that you call free media should be seized, and they seize it.
Do you all think that the media, at least the broadcast portion of it, should be freer for political candidates?
I have thought for a long time, Newton Minow, who was once chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, has explained this point of view, and it's one which I shared with him. And it really is that about 2/3 of the problems of campaign financing would be resolved if other networks, in return for getting free channels on which they make billions of dollars, were obliged, as they do all over Europe, to provide free television in a short period before the election. It is the need for money to buy television that more than anything else has corrupted our whole election system.
And the airwaves belong to us. So that this is
The Federal Communications Act, the original Federal Communications Act, says that radio stations, and by extension television stations, will perform in the public interest and necessity.
But that's gone now,
It's still there on the books.
not enforced.
But it's not being, the deregulation that started with Reagan has been proceeding, and right now there's a fight about further deregulation to make sure that in any one city, it'll be possible soon to control all television, newspapers, and you are in charge of all the news that goes to your city, if this deregulation goes the way it has been going.
Do you all see any likely prospect of reform, of resurrecting the notion of the public interest?
Well, I see a little prospect in that the reaction to this latest deregulation move by the FCC has been so profound that Congress is now trying to change it. And when Congress does something against the wishes of the television lobbyists, you sort of sit up and take notice. There must be an enormous amount of public opinion demanding that they have more than one place to get their news.
Now, to close off, let me ask Phil Bronstein if he would please come out to close off the session. Phil?
I just hate it when panelists have no opinions. I have the unenviable job of closing the program this evening. I hope you have been as enlightened and frankly entertained as I have. I would like to thank Helen Thomas, columnist for Hearst Newspapers, former White House Bureau Chief, UPI. Daniel Shore, senior news analyst for National Public Radio and former correspondent for CBS and CNN. And Scott Linlaw, White House correspondent for the Associated Press. Despite some pessimistic comments, I think we probably all feel a little bit better, if not a lot better, that three people like this are still functioning in the press and functioning so well. We thank them for not just their skill, but their wit, which gets you through some very difficult times. We also thank our audiences here and on the radio, and now this program co-sponsored by the Commonwealth Club of California and the University of California Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism is adjourned, and I have to do this. Thank you all for coming.